Make sure we're protecting our wetlands. One of the changes that happened in the bill is to come up with an inclusive list of sensitive areas. This was, of course, the replacement to ESNARI's areas that are protected based on their rarity, based off their exception, which is something that's hard to put a thumbtack in and say this is exactly ESNARI, this one is not. So instead of doing that, it's changing it to a list of sensitive wild areas. What this amendment does is it broadens that. From the discussions I've had with people who are interested in this bill, including the Wisconsin Wetlands Association, including Ducks Unlimited, including other outdoors and hunting groups, their worry is that the list was originally about 27 long, and then it got truncated to, I think it's 7 pieces of specific wetland types that'll be protected. So what this amendment does is it expands it to include further or other sensitive areas. And that's the main chunk of this. I don't know if you want to talk about the other part about prohibiting discharges. Or maybe not.
Well, first of all, in response to 44, I don't remember the word you used to start this with. I think you said broadens. And that's been the problem. Broad and vague. That's been the problem with ESNARI. I invented ESNARI along with Senator Coles and others. Again, I think you probably heard me at the testimony saying it isn't anything magic. That doesn't mean that it's not important, but it wasn't anything, we created it. As it's kind of like saying, what we've done is we've taken a Chevy Cavalier and we put the Cobalt brand name on it. We changed the taillights and the logo on it. It's still a Chevy Cavalier, even though you're calling it a Cobalt. ESNARI, it's an ESNARI just by a different name. And we spent, I spoke more with these groups that you're talking about than anybody else as the author. And we went through all kinds of things. We went through the current ESNARI list. So, well, this is way too vague because it goes even into things such as aesthetics. So the DNR had come to us and said, we need more specificity. And we had at one time looked at the Wisconsin National Heritage Inventory as maybe a list. But then we started going through that, and it had so many different things. Well, geez, that really isn't as pertinent. And we had those discussions with the different conservation groups and the stakeholders in this. And so after quite some time, I said, well, this is really getting to be, we can't get agreement on this one. So we took that one off the table. DNR came back to us with this list, kind of gleaning off of these different types of things that we had either in place now with either ESNARI or with the heritage inventory, and they came up with a more finite, specific list to create more certainty and to get rid of the vagueness. That's been the problem. That's been an admitted problem with a lot of folks, the Federation and others. It said, we want to know that when you see it, you know what it is, and not kind of leave it up to everyone's interpretation. And that's how we winnowed this down into saying, this is the list. And then when we heard at the hearing, there was one of the things that came up was about sphagnum bogs in southeastern Wisconsin, and how this is a rarity, and that this should be, we find one of these, this is something that we really ought to draw attention to. And this was, caught my attention, as well as, members that have worked on this working group over the months. And so we said, we've also heard that the ephemeral ponds and wooded ponds are very much more common. And in the areas where they really are common, it really aren't areas that lend themselves to, low-grade wetlands and potential fills. But the sphagnum bogs, I said, well, that's a decent trade-off. And so we have a more finite list. That's not to say that over time we come back, we look at it, maybe we delete something off it, maybe we add things to it. But I think this is in a much better place now than the list and the way that we have them interpreting those same areas today, which again, when we did the initial legislation, it was more of a scoping bill. We've learned after 12 years of review, looking at it, that we needed more specificity, and this is what we came up with from our working group.
Mr. Chair, I'm
Yes.
concerned that over time there could be serious damage to our wetlands, and I would prefer to stand with Ducks Unlimited on this one versus DNR people who could be subjected to political pressure.
Well, and I'm just as concerned. I wouldn't have written this legislation if I wasn't concerned about wetlands either, Senator. I know you are a conscientious person about wetlands and outdoors as well. This is very similar also to what the federal government uses in their review list, and we discussed, remember everything we did in this bill, we discussed with the Army Corps of Engineers. They are more of a partner in the process than we've ever had before. We've tried to, wherever possible, make our process and verbiage similar to that with the Fed, with the ACE. And again, this is one of those things that comes into play. And again, this is for GPs, general permits, not individual permits. This is only for GPs. You keep that in mind as well. Any further discussion? Senator?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I appreciate that there was discussions at first with some of these outdoors groups, but simply inviting them in the room before and then talking about a process over the last few weeks does not constitute consensus. And that's why I was talking to them, because they were saying, here's where we thought we were moving towards agreement. This is where when they came before us, they were saying, well, we still hope we can get some of these amendments. And you at the time, last week, we were here, had said that you were willing to take up some of these amendments, take up some of these things. And some of their most important priorities, were turned down. Those include the amendments that I brought forward. This includes this amendment. And I appreciate that you worked with the Army Corps of Engineers, but they're not necessarily on board with every piece of this bill. They came out as neutral on this when we talked to them. They said, yes, there's some areas where it can improve. And simply saying that we're going to change some ways that we tackle wetlands, and saying that there is some problems with the permitting, and then using that as a mask to shuttle in a lot of other problems that you've said twice now that, yes, we may end up having to tackle this again in the future. Let's just solve it now. Let's make sure that we're not overcorrecting. Let's make sure we're not going over a housefly with a cannonball.
My response, first of all, let me be exceedingly clear. No one was locked out. No one. Discussions were had with the Wetlands Association and others, including Senator Jupp, which you will see one of another amendments here. So just let me be very clear to everybody in this room. The process has to come to an end at some point. Everybody doesn't get everything they want. They can go home sad, but everybody's gone away from this process, and this bill was a lot. And this bill is a whole lot better than it was 12 years ago. And in the legislative process, I've been here, Senator, for 16 years. I was the author of the original bill. I have lived this stuff. I know this stuff inside out. And I'll tell you, this is an improvement upon what we had to make this much more distinct, to make it a better process. And, you know, every piece of legislation that I've ever written, that you've ever written, anybody here, there will be times people come back and revisit any and all of our pieces of legislation. It's just like when you set a record for touchdowns or yardage in football. Somebody comes and breaks the record at some point in time. And that's great. And that's what this is all about. But I just want to be, I want you to understand, and I'm not upset with you, but I want you to understand that we have worked really long and hard. You know, and at some point in time you have to say, you know what? It's the fourth quarter, and I don't want to use just all football analogies, but I'm still kind of hurting from the Packer game. Can't get them off my mind. You know, the 2-minute warning has come, and we're down to the last few plays of the game. You know, you still have your opportunities if you want to try to do things on the floor, but for today's purpose of passing this bill out of committee, and I will support this on the floor as well, I think we've done our level best. That doesn't mean that something, you know, there might be some changes and things that myself as the author may be open to between here and when we do get to the floor. But I feel comfortable with where we're at today. But I will, you know, and believe me, any and all of these discussions, I keep all these things in mind. I mean, as was evidenced with Senate Bill 24, which is now SB 26, I mean, we took out a couple dozen different things that came as recommendations from the public hearings, from the public at large. So, I mean, it's not just the groups that we worked with in the working process, we've also incorporated things that we've heard in the testimony as well. Any further discussion? If not, clerk will call roll.
Senator Kedzie?
No?
Moulton? No. Weingart?
No.
Galloway?
No.
Wirch?
Aye.
Oprin?
Aye.
Larson?
Aye.